down on prey, on we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome to Eschatology Matters. We are part of the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network, and I am your host for today, Jacob Tanner, and we are excited to have returning to the show, John Harris, part of Conversations That Matter. John has recently released a great new documentary that we're going to be discussing today, Virginia First, the 1607 Project. And so, guys, we're going to be getting a little historical today. We're going to be getting a little political today. And of course, as you're going to find out, eschatology truly does matter in a multitude of different ways. But John, thank you for coming back on the show today.
I appreciate it, Jacob. It's always good to be invited back somewhere.
Yeah. And this documentary, I don't want to give everything away because obviously we want people to watch what you've created with this. But even the title itself was interesting to me when I first saw it, because Virginia First, the 1607 Project, immediately made me think of the 1619 project from a few years back. And I think people are still trying to push that. So was this kind of a direct front to that? Was this kind of a combat against that?
Yeah, it was an idea that I had back in 2020, I think, is when I first thought about it. And it might not have been until 2021 I actually sent an email out. I don't remember, but the idea was that the 1619 project was, and still is, highly influential, was being picked up by all kinds of educators and high-profile figures. And at the same time, you had at the end of the Trump presidency a 1776 commission, and their job was to answer the 1619 project, essentially, and that narrative. And so they created a short document. You can go look it up online. I mean, it's a dead document at this point because the Biden administration obviously didn't honor it, but it frames American history differently. At least they think it's differently, and it's more of a right-wing take. And so you had these competing narratives, and I looked at both of them. I just said neither of these is correct, and actually they're more similar to each other than I think either would probably want to admit, because they both buy into this proposition nation idea, which is just the understanding of America that it's this universal idea, not a particular people or place. And in both cases, they start out with that assumption. The difference between the two, broadly speaking, is that the 1619 Project says that the America of 1776 and 1787 and really it's the Declaration of Independence where they source this mostly, but they'll say that that dream of equality has all men being created equal, that's where they take the equality from, has never been realized. That's 1619. 1776 Commission said, no, it has been realized. We had a civil rights movement. And so everything's good to go. That's pretty much, in my opinion, the difference between the two. So they recruit in the 1776 Commission report MLK and civil rights leaders as quintessential, great Americans. But more than that, they're also conservatives now. And so they become part of the pantheon. And of course, they give the shaft to historical figures that I think probably deserve a greater place of prominence and always enjoyed a greater place of prominence until recently. And so I see it as a somewhat of a cave to the left, the narrative that we're currently, unfortunately, forced to adopt in most neoconservative circles. So anyway, long story short, sorry, I'm rambling, but the 1607 Project was my attempt to say, look, it's not 1776, it's not 1619 when supposedly they were really probably more indentured servants, but slaves show up in Virginia. It's not even 1620 when the Pilgrims came. There's already, America existed before that, and that was in Virginia. And Virginia really does have an outsized influence in early American history, and even continuing past the Civil War, when they lost a lot of their political influence, there was cultural influence that we can still feel. And so I think the real tangible America, what we think of when Europeans think of America, really stems back more to Virginia. And Northeasterners and people from Massachusetts in particular have treated the South kind of like a stepchild. They're the odd kind of other. And I think it's time to say that's not right. Actually, the for most of the beginning of American history, at least, the Northeast was considered to be the more odd kind of part of
Mhm.
the country. They're both part of the United States, obviously, but but Virginia really does deserve a place of prominence, and so that's what the project is about.
Yeah. And not only is it helpful, but speaking as somebody who grew up in the North, obviously, in fact, Long Island, New York, what I learned from, elementary school history was completely like 100% the opposite of what you're presenting within the documentary. Because as you're saying, there was this idea presented to us over and over and over again that the South was terrible. And it was the Northeast in particular from which you had American culture, even the founding of America spring forth, with Plymouth and everything else. But you're absolutely right in the documentary that actually it's from Virginia, 1607, where we start to see America take shape, take root, take form. Culture begins to develop in a multitude, a manifold of different ways. Now,
Yeah,
let's go back to this idea because I think this is fascinating. One of the ways that you open the documentary is with different sort of quotes, different sort of interviews that you're showing where people keep talking about the idea of
yeah,
America. Let's return to the idea of America. And we have that, like you said, on both liberal and conservative sides. The idea. And usually it relates to the first part of the Constitution that we are created equal, we have inalienable rights. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Let's go a little bit more in depth on that. What are they saying when they do that? When they take like MLK and they say he was suddenly a great Christian leader, which he wasn't. He did a lot of awful things. What are they trying to present? What are they trying to do
yeah.
modern day with
That
all of these
scene
ideas?
That scene was added in later, actually. So we had a premiere at an event in Georgia, and after we were done with the premiere, there's a few edits we wanted to make, and one of the things that we talked about was, hey, there's really no shark attack scene, and as a documentary filmmaker yourself, I'm sure you're familiar with that. That there needs to be a kind of a problem that's presented, or something that grabs your attention in the beginning of the documentary. And so we actually just decided, hey, let's open with the shark attack scene with the this is the problem, and it's a problem you probably never noticed before. But now that I'm putting all these clips next to each other of every president, I think since Jimmy Carter, I think
Hmm.
I put clips from Jimmy Carter to every president up to, with the exception of Donald Trump, to Joe Biden.
Hmm.
And then, of course, other figures that are in national prominence, entertainers and politicians. And they all keep saying it's like they're in a choir. They're all saying they're singing the
Right.
same song, America's an idea. And some of them expand a little bit on that, but all the clips are intended to convey to the audience that there's this really odd notion that no other country on earth shares with us. No other country says our country is an idea. You
Right.
know, French don't say, France is just an idea. People from the Sudan don't say Sudan's an idea. People from Israel don't say Israel's an idea. In fact, Israel right now is very much a people and a piece of land, right? And they're
Uh-huh.
very adamant about this, that it's these boundaries, it's this land. But it's in America that you have this very odd, in the history of the world, conception of the country from the elites as being this abstraction. And really, what it is it's for the left, equality. For the right, I would say, broadly speaking, it's freedom. But you'll hear both. In fact, I just saw before we started recording Kamala Harris talking about both freedom and equality, that that's what
Uh-huh.
America is, right? So often these two come together, but they're very vague notions and they are bendable. You can change them. So if some aggrieved party says we need gay marriage, then hey, you can bend it a little and say, hey, we're about equality. So of course, come on in and we'll extend that to you. And
In other words, you can keep appealing to the idea, that there's an idea of America and you can bend it any
yeah,
way that you want. And that's what we see happen with the Constitution a lot of the time too, right? We see people coming along and they're suddenly defining the terms that are used within it, not at all in the way that they were meant, but they're defining them from their modernistic, post-Christian 21st century viewpoint. And it does absolute damage and violence to what the original authors intended. It's funny because as a pastor, I relate this a lot to hermeneutics. And when you're studying scripture and interpreting scripture, you want to understand the historical and the grammatical and the redemptive themes that are happening here. But it's like when it comes to political theory, when it comes to understanding history, hermeneutics are thrown out the window, and people are always trying to look at it from our modern vantage point, which you simply can't do if you
Like,
want to understand history.
I think in theology you have the same thing because how
Mhm.
many people say, well, the intention of Jesus was love, so we can
Right.
ignore what Paul says here about
Yeah.
women, right? So it's the same exact thing. They'll say, well, the intentions of the founders were equality. So even though they didn't live up to that standard themselves, perhaps, and they didn't achieve it in their lifetime, we're carrying on their mission. And that's why we can actually even override the institutions and arrangements and things that they valued in the name of them. It's kind of crazy, but that's how it works. And I think it's the same exact thing happening in theological circles, you know, when you
Hmm.
use that hermeneutic of love or whatever to
Oh,
override
absolutely.
grammar.
And I think too, we even see it because there's a lot of people are going to listen to this that are going to go, well, it's just the left. The right doesn't do this at all. But actually, the right does do the same exact thing sometimes. For example, taking Martin Luther King Jr. and saying, well, he's one of us and he's a representation of conservatism, or Christians even do this. You know, how many years ago was it now? They did the MLK conference. I don't know if you remember that or not.
MLK
Uh,
50, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
where they tried to make a big deal that, he was a great Christian leader, but seemed to neglect the fact that he was an adulterer, that he cheated on it. He did all of these crazy things. And it's like even if he had a couple of good points that we can say, yeah, okay, that was good. It's not good to take these leaders and say suddenly that they were something they weren't. And
Right.
that's what we see happening on both the left and the right. They kind of try to preemptively take these individuals from the other side and say, actually, they belong to us. And it's one of those things, too, that we see happening, like I said, with the Constitution, where people are trying to rewrite it. They're trying to reinterpret it in a way that it simply never was meant to be interpreted. And so, as we're talking about this, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson for a second, because he pops up a couple of times
Sure.
throughout the documentary. Jefferson, I was always told growing up, and I've come to change my view on this, but I was always told growing up that he was a deist, that he rejected Christianity. Let's start with that. What
Okay.
was Thomas Jefferson exactly?
Well, the project doesn't really get into answering that question, and it's not because we can't. It's more just it's not the focus. But yeah, since you asked, Thomas Jefferson, I think would have been actually. Sam Smith actually may say this in the
He
documentary. Now
does,
that I
yep.
think about it, he may actually. There might be like a passing quote where he says that he was kind of like a secularized. I don't remember what word he used, but
I
an
think he used
Anglo
the word nominal.
nominal. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're right. Nominal Anglican.
Yep.
So, he respected Christianity, respected the teachings of Christ. He had a relationship with Charles Clay, which Sam Smith does talk about. Of course, in the documentary, that's in relationship to federalism and Christianity's relationship to the system that we adopted. But I think beyond that, some of this is speculation. But Thomas Jefferson, he gave a lot of money to setting up a church in Charlottesville. I think it was called the Calvinistic Reformed Church or something like that. But it was Charles Clay was the one who was overseeing that, and it shows that Thomas Jefferson had to him at least, Christianity was very important civically. He was willing to give his personal wealth to the creation of this church. You see the same thing with Benjamin Franklin giving to George Whitefield. I mean, they were very
Right. Yeah.
supportive of cultural Christianity. And Thomas Jefferson also wrote the Sabbatarian law that got passed in Virginia, basically making it an offense to break the Sabbath, or at least to cause a disturbance, I
Mhm.
should say, on the Sabbath. So,
And that's a fascinating one, isn't it? Because
yeah.
I thinking back on this, I don't remember a single time growing up where I was ever, even in church circles, if people brought up Thomas Jefferson, it wasn't necessarily that he was a bad guy, but it was more so he wasn't one of us. But then as you hear all of these things and you actually study history, you find out, well, the guy actually supported the planting of a church, basically. He put a law into effect that made it so that you couldn't break the Sabbath. this seems as though he actually wasn't an opponent of Christianity, but was in fact somebody who was a friend of Christians. In fact, I would go so far as to say it seems as though he was himself a Christian. Maybe had some strange beliefs, of course, but it seems as though.
Well, yeah, you could say in a cultural sense, certainly,
Hmm.
there are things, for example, he thought the Trinity was somewhat ridiculous, which is it's
Yeah.
that kind of thing that gets him the deist label, or they'll say the Jefferson Bible, which is really just the life and teachings of Jesus, is proof that he was a deist. But I don't think that that's proof. It's more Jefferson was just compiling Jesus's teachings. It
Right.
wasn't because he was denying the miraculous necessarily. Whether he did or not, I suppose, could be an open question. But that in itself is not proof of that. It's more just he valued the teachings of Jesus so much he wanted them in a compact form so he could reference them. So,
And he
um,
saw within the nation,
yeah,
within the founding of America, that there was great value in
yeah,
Christianity. He
yeah,
wasn't opposed to it. He was in fact promoting it in
yeah.
different ways. And again, yeah, we can have a lot of debate. Was he a Christian? Wasn't he? The Trinity thing is actually where I get the most hung up with him of trying to figure out, what was going on with this guy. But regardless, as we think on Jefferson and sort of his framing of some of our most important founding documents, how did he understand something like separation of church and state, for example?
It's hard to put on a modernist lens and look at this because we think of separation of church and state, I think is where we need to start,
Hmm.
as anything goes, including Satan statues in the capitals of states. So we have a very expansive view of it. Jefferson didn't live in our world, so it's somewhat I guess the word anachronistic. It's somewhat
Hmm.
it's a fallacy of presentism to go back and try to read all those things into Jefferson
Right.
and say Jefferson believed uh, that we could have Satan monuments, or Jefferson believed that Islam was should be tolerated the same way as Christianity should be tolerated. Some people will argue based on things like, well, he had a copy of the Quran, but he was fighting the Barbary pirates, so yeah, I mean, he had to understand who he was dealing with. That's really
Hmm.
why he had that. It wasn't because he was attracted to Islam. That's all speculation.
Right.
And we didn't have Muslims in the country. So the way that I would put it is this: Thomas Jefferson lived in a day and age where there were different flavors of Christianity present in the United States and different mixes of those flavors in different colonies or states. In Virginia, it was primarily Anglican, but you had a lot of Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians coming in at a very pretty early stage. And this is what led ultimately to the adoption of Jefferson's and Madison's religious toleration bill, which essentially made it so that you're not penalized for not agreeing with I think it was 32 of the 39 articles in
Right.
the book in the Anglican tradition. You can have a license to preach. You have the freedom to have a Baptist church, for example, without that being a problem. And that's really what they were addressing, I think, more than anything else. So it's a
Right.
pan-Protestantism that they're doing this in. There's very thin evidence to try to suggest, really, I don't think there is any, but people will try to suggest that this was expansive. This was supposed to be extended beyond that to all these other religions. They'll look at like a letter from Richard Henry Lee where he talks about Mohammedans, and this is going to lead to their acceptance as well. But that's just one letter from one guy who wasn't part of drafting the bill,
Hmm.
and it's also it, it's a world even Richard Henry Lee couldn't conceive of what that would look like today.
Right.
What are we gonna have, like two Muslims maybe here, and we'll let them do their thing. I mean that's a very Virginian thing to do, is to kind of look at the situation you're in and and ask yourself what is the best for this particular situation for keeping the peace. What's the best for our people? It may be that there are Jewish people, a very small minority of Jewish people, but they are going to worship in the synagogue. It's not bothering anyone else specifically. They're not trying to go and tell people to convert them to their religion. They just want to go do it somewhere. So you have, like in Washington's army, this kind of thing is allowed. But in New England, you don't see as much of that. In New England, it is very much a forced, it's congregationalism. There is no other option. And if you are against what we're doing, you're going to be taxed anyways to support the Congregational Church, or you might be booted if you cause too much of a disturbance by rejecting the religion. So you have kind of different sentiments developing in these different places, but no matter where you're looking at in the United States, including in Jefferson's Virginia, it's a pan-Protestant project, pretty much. We're talking about different flavors of Protestantism and whether or not we're going to allow them to live side by side in peace. And that's what
Right.
Jefferson was about.
And that's one of those things, again, I was never taught growing up, because what I was taught was this idea that separation of church and state and this whole idea of religious tolerance was all about allowing Islam, allowing all of these different religions to come in, atheism, all of these different things to come to America and to participate in this idea of liberty, justice, and equality for all. But what the documentary presents is that, at least within Virginia, as opposed to the Northern England states, was that we were establishing, as you said, a pan-Protestantism, which I think is vitally important to understand, that it wasn't Christianity against Islam and we're coming and uniting together. It was just different branches of Christianity, different branches of Protestantism coming together and saying, okay, and, like you said, if we're going to have two Muslims or two Jews, then we'll figure that out as we go on. But this Virginian perspective obviously is very different. And what amazes me, I've talked about this before, I don't think on the podcast though. What amazes me is that you have the Pilgrims, the Puritans coming over because they want to escape religious persecution. You have a guy like John Bunyan who's being jailed in England for not having that license to preach. And so you have in Virginia, they're saying, well, you'll be licensed to preach regardless. You don't have to worry about being thrown into prison. But then in the northeastern states, what you have is actually religious oppression being afflicted upon those who are actually brothers and sisters in Christ. And so it's an interesting dilemma that is forming there, where it seems as though the Puritans who were escaping religious persecution actually begin to persecute their brothers and
Well,
sisters,
that
which
was
is
a critique that Cavaliers had of Puritans even back in England,
Mhm.
you want essentially the freedom to tyrannize us. That's what you want. You're not going to be satisfied with being left alone or living side by side until you have to have it your way. And we see that, that same spirit with modern leftists. I should probably
Mhm.
note, because, we talk about the Virginia perspective, the New England perspective. I mean, there is obviously exceptions. It took time to kind of develop some of these things. Someone like a Patrick Henry was fairly critical of the Bill of Religious Toleration.
Mhm.
And, obviously not everyone voted for it. So there were people in Virginia who still wanted an Anglican or Episcopalian church to be the official church. But I think as demographics changed, that contributed to the change. But I do think there is, I said sentiment, but if you want to say attitude, there was this, I think, different attitude where you have landed gentry who are pretty much farmers, they're plantation owners. And there's a perspective, I think, that comes with that. Whereas in New England, it's a lot of not saying there weren't farmers, but it's a lot of shipping, it's a lot of business, right? And when you're a planter and you're in the planted aristocracy and you view yourself as having a responsibility to your people, and your people are the ones that you have connection to who live around you, you tend to you tend to have your hands in the soil. Everything's more tangible, and it's less dollars and cents values and more, uh, I would say, a personal kind of relationship values. Is this going to hurt the connections we have to each other and to our land? Not whether or not it lines my own pockets. And so, this attitude extends out into all kinds of other things as well. But I think religion's just simply one of them, where they're looking at the situation and they're saying, what's best for our people? And what seems to be best is for us not to continue with this official Anglican church that everyone must subscribe to, but to extend a toleration out to these other sects.
Mhm.
And that attitude, I think, it predated the even before that bill was passed. That attitude was still present. That's kind of a cavalier mindset.
Right. And so I have to ask the question then, just because why not? We're talking about all of these things. If we're looking at 1607 as being really where America starts to find its founding. Did America have a Christian founding?
Ha! Uh, I would say undoubtedly yes. And I think if you ask people at the time, they probably didn't know that they were founding, the United States or
Right,
something
right,
like
yeah.
that. But they would have, if you said to them, did Virginia have, is Virginia Christian? Everyone would looked at you like you had two heads. Like, what do you, of course, like,
Hmm.
that's just like, it's a weird question to ask. Obviously we're a Christian people. So you see in their charter from 1606, it specifically talks about something very controversial today, but it mentions the Christian prince and it acknowledges other Christian princes, and so the understanding that other European countries with Christianity are settling in the New World, and
Right. Hmm.
that the Christian prince or the magistrate in Virginia has a duty, and one of those things is to evangelize the tribes around them, the pagan tribes. And so, this was baked into the foundation of Jamestown. Oftentimes, Jamestown is viewed as just a business enterprise, which is funny because I was just talking about how the Puritans were more the dollars and cents as time went on, especially. Um, and the official, I would say, history tends to be the opposite. The Puritans
Hmm.
they were just about religion, and Jamestown was just about dollars and cents. There is a sense in which that's true, and in this way that Jamestown, they were settlers. They were there, yes, to make money, but it was also to form a life. It was for families to come over. You had adventurers who were there as well, but
Hmm.
it was families established all along the James River, all kinds of settlements before the Pilgrims got there. In fact, the Pilgrims were trying to get there. It was a mistake that they went to Massachusetts. Um, and they were a little different than the Puritans, I should say. They got absorbed into that,
Right.
but the people who settled there were bringing their European traditions with them, and that included Christianity. So it
Hmm.
wasn't that they were on a mission for, we're going to establish a utopia here for Christ. It was more just, we're just bringing what we have with us and we're creating a life here, and that includes Christianity. Whereas in New
Hmm.
England, yeah, there was a very much we're coming here to create this great new society, this city upon a hill, and all the world's going to look at us and they're going to see that we're doing it right. And so there's this kind of apocalyptic mission. At the same time, though, I mean, the industries and stuff they get involved in very quickly. They're seafaring people, and I mean, I live in New York. I mean, you grew up
Hmm.
in Long Island, and we're not far from Yankeedom. Some would say we're in Yankeedom. Um, I mean, the society that's created here now, at least, is very much a market driven. What kind of job do you do? That's the first
Oh,
question.
absolutely, yeah.
In the South, the first question is generally, if you're not in an urban area at least, and because I've lived in the South and people say, "Hey, where are you from?" That's the first question, right?
Hmm.
That's the difference between Jamestown and I think Plymouth too. Uh, so, the Puritans having this Protestant work ethic, as Max Weber talks about, they're all hands on deck for building this great society.
Right.
They're moving towards it. Some people have compared it like a stagecoach to a farm, whereas in the South and Virginia, hey, things get muddy on the farm. The pig does its thing, the horse does its thing, but we're all going to be living on the farm together, and this is the best we can hope for because this is not heaven. Whereas the
Hmm.
Puritans, it's a stagecoach, and each person's got to run. That you got reins on you. You're going to make sure you're going in this direction, and you're going to achieve whatever the objective is. So I think those analogies do well to kind of show the difference between the two regions.
Right. And one of the things that I like about this, from an eschatological perspective, is this idea that in the South, you had your very, if I could use the phrase, salt of the earth type of people who were coming along and saying, "Hey, we're gonna live here. This is where we're gonna build. Our generations after us, they're gonna live here as well." Now, I would make the case that we need both perspectives. We need the perspective that others are watching, so let's be the city on the hill. But we also need the perspective of, hey, what we're doing right now matters. Right now matters for eternity, to borrow Sproul's quote. And so I think that's what you see happening in the South a lot of the time is they're looking at it and they're saying, yeah, we're going to settle here. We're going to start families. We're gonna have farms. We're going to start churches, and we're going to live here. And generations after us are going to live here, and we're just going to focus on these things. And there's a simplistic beauty to that, I think,
Yeah.
that we really do need today as well. This idea that we're working for the future, working for future generations, not just those who are outside of our nation, right? But those who are here, those who are our children, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren. We want to build something for them, something tangible, right? That's not just market driven. It's not just about me getting ahead right now. It's about what am I going to provide
Well,
for my
I
children
think the
later?
question is, do you sacrifice your own children, who you know and love and see in real life, for your dream of
Right.
achieving some kind of utopia, or, what that city on the hill that we were talking about, is it worth it to sacrifice your children for achieving that? And I think
Mhm.
the answer is no. It's,
Right.
and of course, if your dream conflicts with the well-being of your children, then it's probably not a good dream to have
Right. Right.
in the
Right.
first place. But yeah, I mean, from an eschatological perspective, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I mean, my understanding, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think the Anglican Church was more amillennial. The Puritans, I
They were.
know, I know there's a lot of post-mill Puritans, but I think that ranges a bit with the Puritans, because
It
I know
does.
there
There,
were,
a lot of people think that all of the Puritans were post-mill,
right.
and they weren't. You had guys that were for sure, guys like Edwards, guys like Owen, obviously, but not all of them were post-millennial. And same thing, those coming out of the Anglican Church. But what makes it difficult to try to pinpoint from a historical perspective is a lot of the time they're not really concerned with words like amillennialism and postmillennialism because it really didn't exist.
Right. These are
Uh,
modern things
yeah,
that we, yeah.
those are modern terms. So that's why you have guys that will go back and they'll go, well, look, everybody from Augustine onward was amillennial. And you go, well, no, you can't do that because amillennialism as a term didn't exist. And so what you have really are different forms of postmillennialism and premillennialism. Uh, onward. And so
Hmm.
I think though what you can make the case for, arguably, reading back today into yesterday, is that yeah, in the Anglican Church you would have more of a sort of streamlined amillennialism as opposed to the Puritan postmillennialism. But again, you're going to have differences in
Yeah.
in both of those
Well,
that
I
are
think many of the Southern Presbyterians, like Dabney and Thornwell, I think they were both post-millennial, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, so later
Um,
on and
yeah.
it's interesting. This is something I would love to trace more of because it's fascinating to me that what you have in the North, and you touch on this in the documentary, is somehow that Puritanism sort of veers off course and makes way for liberalism and even a rejection of Christianity.
Yeah.
Whereas in the South, you have Christianity beginning to take even greater hold on these people so that you have later on a Dabney, a Thornwell, all of these different great Southern Presbyterians who were, in fact, not just post-millennial, but they were, again, reading back today into yesterday, they were conservative in their beliefs.
Yeah.
They were orthodox. They were holding to creeds and confessions. And it's fascinating that you see that change of course happen. So do you want to touch on that in the North? How do we go
Well,
from that to liberalism?
yeah, and we talk about it a little bit. We touch on it, I suppose, in the documentary. We don't. It's about Virginia, obviously. It's
Right.
so we contrast with New England, but it's not a documentary about New England or Puritans.
And
But
by the way, let me just throw this in there. It doesn't attack New England either. That's not the goal of the
no,
documentary.
but I've been accused of that by even some of my own fans of my podcast are upset that this documentary they think attacks Puritans, and I don't see that. I don't think so. Sam Smith,
As a
well,
guy who loves the Puritans, I will say I don't feel like it attacked the Puritans. I
yeah,
feel like we sometimes practice hero worship in Christianity. We are great at making idols of even fellow Christians. And we have to be very careful about that. Rather than worshiping these men, we have to realize that they were imperfect,
that's
just
right.
like us. They had blind spots, just like we do. And that's why we read them, right? They had a lot of really helpful material. I mean, I don't know if anybody's able to see on my shelf if they're watching the video. I am surrounded by Puritan books. I love the Puritans, but they weren't perfect.
Yeah, and I've gleaned a lot from the Puritans as well. So I would not stand for it if it was an outright attack that just dismissed everything Puritans ever said or did. And Sam Smith, who's the chair of the history department at Liberty University, at one point says, "Hey, I love the Puritans' theology."
Hmm.
And he says, "I don't think they wore their Calvinism well when it came to constructing a society." But he commends Geneva Calvinism. I mean, someone was saying it's anti-Calvinism. I'm like, I don't know how you get that, because he's basically arguing that our system of government comes from Calvinism. But
Hmm.
what he means
I would agree
by,
with that.
he doesn't think they constructed a good society. And he's talking about American Puritans, to be
Hmm.
fair. He's not talking about just English Puritans. He's saying that they, if you look at their society and you see what happened to it within about a generation, they're already having problems. And Jonathan Edwards talks about this issue, that they have, they're willing to accept all these higher critical ideas and eventually Darwinian ideas and stuff. But in the
Right.
early 1800s, the congregational churches in New England go Unitarian overnight. It's incredible how fast. I mean, we've never seen anything like this in the history of the country, I believe, on a denominational level, where you have such a flip.
Right.
And what is that? What is Unitarianism? Well, it's this rationalistic kind of, again, abstractions. It's against tradition, and that's one of the main thing I think that separates the South and the North, is the South does retain tradition more,
Right.
and that includes in their Christianity. But they end up going Unitarian and Transcendentalist, and you have all these reform movements that form around the same time and continue during the second part of the 19th century. Social gospel movement comes from that. So I'm talking about anti-Masonry and abolitionism and women's suffrage, and it's not even just suffrage, women's rights, and um, I don't know. There's more than that, but anti-drinking. All of this stuff arises where? In New England. It arises in the North, and then eventually in some parts of the Midwest where that influence is felt. And it turns into the social gospel, and that eventually turns into, really, a few steps later, modern liberalism, or if you want to call it leftism. That's probably a better term. But you have the modern left, and you could look at an election map some night, and just look at the Northeast, and you can see exactly what I'm talking about. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. So it's perplexing to me sometimes that modern conservatives and modern Christian conservatives, in fact, they want to say that the key to getting back to everything is we got to just copy the Puritans on everything. And I would say copy their good stuff, but
Hmm.
also try to locate where they had a problem, because obviously there was a problem somewhere along the lines. And that's really, I think, what happened was when they secularized, when the Puritans became Yankees, as some people say,
Hmm.
and they lost their Christianity, they kept that spirit of perfectionism and conforming everything to the abstractions in their mind. That ideology was still there. It was really a fanaticism.
Right.
And I think that's the key thing. It's not that they were post millennial, because some people will say, well, that's what led to the social gospel, and then the fundamentalists had to react to that, and they were more, Disby pre-mill.
Hmm.
But even the fundamentalist movement comes out of the North, which is funny, and they retained a lot of the same things, a lot of the same rules and things. So history is complicated, but it's the
It is a
fanaticism.
little bit complicated.
It's not the eschatology that I think drove them to that per se. I think that
Right.
fit into it. They use that as a vehicle. We're creating the kingdom here, but it was the fanaticism. It was the sort of like a Tower of Babel mentality that they had for conforming everything and thinking they could achieve this. Whereas I think
That's a good analogy.
In the South, even if you're post-mill, even if you're a Dabney, Thornwell actually has a good quote on this. Um, and I can't remember exactly what he says, but it basically along the lines of, uh, we are looking out for the providence of God. We are conforming our lives to the natural rhythms that God has laid down. And in his time, these things will take place, but we're not out there attempting to force something that God is not forcing. We're not trying to rigidly, like, just take everything, even including nature, and conform it to our ideas of what perfection looks like, because we think that that's going to usher in some kind of a great age of progress. Um, so I think that's the difference. It's this spirit, and that's why it's a little hard to sometimes locate in discussions with people about this, because it is an attitude, it's a disposition. They're bringing just a mentality that's different to sometimes the same or similar theology.
Yeah. And again, I think the thing that we need to highlight here, you said it earlier, that even as we look to the Puritans or even as we look to the South, we have to recognize they didn't get everything perfect,
No.
but there's good things that we can draw from them. And
Right.
especially, I would agree with the documentary. There's a lot of good things that we can draw from Virginia, especially around 1607 and what they were doing there. Now, here's another question, because I think if listeners are like me and you grew up Northeast, you just have some things that you're confused about. Can you briefly just define what is the Federalist perspective exactly, and what was the opposition that they were receiving?
Oh, okay. So like the Federalists and Anti-Federalists then,
Yep, yep.
or okay, so yeah, the Federalists were generally in support of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution, or at least some of them were satisfied if there was a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. And if people, remember their American history, we had the Articles of Confederation. We
Mhm.
lived under that before the Constitution of 1787. You think, wait, 1776 and then 1787, and why, that gap was governed by the Articles of Confederation,
Right.
which were a loose document. Ironically, in the document itself, it says it's supposed to be perpetual, but it obviously wasn't. We seceded from that and we formed something new because it wasn't working out. And we, the official history, and there's some truth to this, I suppose, that we needed something that was a bit stronger, that the government needed the right to tax, and we needed to be able to compel states to do certain things, or else, what's the point? And so we went from this loose arrangement to a more tight arrangement, if you want to think of it that way. And the Anti-Federalists were just very skeptical of this. They didn't like concentrated power. So one of the things Barry Shane says in the documentary, though, is that actually the Anti-Federalists, this is the confusing part, were the Federalists, and the Federalists were the Nationalists, because we talk about our federal government today, and it doesn't make
Yep.
sense either. We're talking about a general kind of national government, not a federal government is, as the word implies, or confederation, is sovereigns that are banded together for a common cause or purpose. And that's what we were. That's what, as the name implies, the Confederacy, the Southern Confederacy, was trying to bring back a sense of that. What the Constitution was supposed to honor this arrangement. That's why there's a 10th Amendment even in our Bill of Rights, and there's very limited powers given to the presidency and the judiciary and the Congress. But the scary thing for the Anti-Federalists, who were actually the real Federalists, they wanted states to still retain that sovereignty, was that they saw the writing on the wall. They saw this is too strong. There's, you have elastic clauses in this. It's going to be used by the wrong people to enact centralization. And that's exactly what happened. They were 100% right.
Hmm.
And starting with Alexander Hamilton and wanting a national bank
Right.
and a means by which to have finance controlled. And then John Marshall, who's actually is from Virginia, but he ended up, he was more of a strong Federalist. Washington was actually very influenced by Federalists.
Hmm.
They did set the stage for what later came about, which was called the American system. Henry Clay championed that, and then of course Abraham Lincoln. And once we get to Lincoln, this government has gotten so big and strong that we have the formation of the modern deep state at that point, and we've
Right.
never been able to get rid of it since then. Um, yeah, it's fascinating. These things develop over time, and I think any one of them, probably even Alexander Hamilton, maybe not, but I think any of them, if they saw what we were living with today, would have been horrified.
Oh,
But
absolutely. 100%. This is
yeah.
a lot of what we're encountering today is a lot of what I think they were trying to avoid, a lot of what they were trying to escape from. And the idea of limited government, I think, is something that we really do need to recover. One of my sayings that I like to give to people is that I like my government just like I like my atonement, limited. Uh, and it's one of those things that people just absolutely they miss it today. They miss it. And in the United States of America, what we need is a limited government. Otherwise, what you end up with is tyranny. You end up with a government that comes along and says you got to get a vaccine. You got to get a shot. And if you don't get it, then you're going to be penalized in multiple different ways. And if we want to recover what classical Americanism would have been, according to, Virginia. We need limited government, and we need also to recognize that, yeah, Christ is King, Christ is Lord, and so these heroes of ours, and we can have them, that's fine. But they had blind spots. If we want to actually have a recovery of, and not even just a recovery, if we want something better than what our forefathers in this land gave to us, then what we need is really to return to the Bible. We need to return to Scripture. So recognize these guys are good, but they're not perfect. The only
Yeah.
perfect one is Jesus, and the only perfect word is the Bible. And so we have a lot of
Amen.
conversations that need to take place, a lot of things that need to happen. But I think the recognition that needs to take place first is exactly what you touch on in the documentary, that we can actually trace the founding of America not to 1619. That project is terrible. Not even to 1776, but actually to 1607 with Virginia. So with all that in mind, I don't want to give more of the documentary away because I really do think people should watch it, and I think that they will glean a lot from it if they're willing to engage it. But do you have any sort of closing words that you want to give to people so that they would be encouraged to go and seek out this documentary?
Well, I think, Jacob, you mentioned something that is important for Christians to understand. It said in the documentary at one point that Calvinism, Geneva Calvinism, is almost a synonym with federalism because there's this idea in the Reformed tradition, the Christian Reformed tradition, that man is evil and must be limited, and that's really what the founders were thinking through when they crafted our founding documents. That was one of the main things that we
Mhm.
we don't want a rule by the mob, but neither do we want a centralized authority that can be easily corrupted and wants power.
Right.
We want something with checks and balances to make sure that man's evil is somewhat stymied. And I think that's the brilliance of the Virginia First project because in 1619, if you want to pick that year as a significant year, that was the first elected legislature in
Mhm.
the modern, now we call it United States, but on the North American continent. And that was in Virginia. And
Right.
what they brought with them was English common law, which has this understanding already built into it that there should be checks and balances between those in authority and those who they are called to serve. And then you see this exemplified in the character of men from Virginia who saw as their duty in life to serve the people that were under them. That's why Washington was never paid. He didn't
Mhm.
need he wasn't there to get wealthy. He was there to serve. He was there to make sure that the people in his proximity were taken care of. And so we see these different models of what leadership should look like in a federal system and the benefits of a federal system springing out first in Virginia. And I would love to get back to that. I don't, in our modern paradigm, it's going to be interesting to see how that would even take place. But I think
Mhm.
the first part is to get involved in the local level. And so if people take nothing else from this documentary, localism, getting involved with the tangible people in your community, doing what's best for them instead of uh, always looking to the center, always thinking through, Biden and Trump and what's going to be best for us politically on the national level or something. Think about the people in your actual tangible communities. Think like the settlers did in 1607 when they had to cling to
Right.
each other and they were just trying to pass something down to the kids that came after them.
Yeah. What's the saying? County before country, right?
Yeah, it's Michael Foster's
That's right.
thing,
Yeah.
I think. Right. Yeah.
Yep. And remember, Christ is king. So if you got those things right, then we can actually see tangible differences being made. If anybody's listening to this and they're going, nah, that's impossible. Well, remember, with God, all things are possible. So we actually can see a return to this. And I would argue we can even see something better than this form, but it's going to take Christians that are committed to actually being local, Christians that are committed to their counties and being involved, not just politically, but actually being involved in their local counties where they're living. So with all of that in mind, again, the documentary is Virginia First, the 1607 Project. Where can we're going to try to put it in the show notes, and also we'll try to link it below on YouTube. But where can people watch this if they'd like to go watch it?
They can go to, I believe it's 1607project.com. I'm just going to make sure that that's right. And I'm giving you the right, let's see if it comes up. Yep, that's it, 1607project.com. And I should mention there is a book that accompanies this as well. So
Mhm.
if people want to dig deeper into what the documentary talks about, grab the book and check it out.
Yeah, definitely. And this comes highly recommended from me. Really enjoyed it, and I thank you, John, for your work on it. And let this be an encouragement, too, for all of our listeners. Even if you're not in the United States, study the history of your country. Study, what brought us to the point where we're currently at. And at the same time, be asking yourself, how can I be involved in such a way that I can promote godliness, that I can actually help my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren to inherit something better than what I had. And let's focus too on this fact that Christ really is king. And as eschatology does matter, we know that we're heading towards a very particular, very definite end where Christ is going to return and he will reign as king over everything. But until then, we're imperfect people, we're sinners, and we need a limited government. So let's work on these different things. John, thank you again for being on the show today. And I want to encourage everybody, please go check out Virginia First, the 1607 Project. Until next time, God bless.
God bless.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake. The Lord